Hey everyone, so Kid and Law just defeated Big Mom, but in less of a conclusive manner than most people were expecting. It's not exactly as though they knocked her out, but rather a combination of their strategy and specific external circumstances led to her being at least taken out of the game for the moment. And so some people are not completely satisfied with this, saying that this wasn't quite climactic enough for the first time that the new generation takes out a Yonko, that they didn't truly dethrone her. And what I think most people are ignoring is how ridiculously important it is that for Big Mom's true, final defeat in the story, it absolutely has to be at the hands of Luffy. What just happened with Kid and Law getting the better of Big Mom works perfectly as a symbolic victory for them, giving them a nice win, without nixing the far more important inevitable conflict of Luffy versus Big Mom. I had my concerns when Kid and Law were suddenly matched up against Big Mom earlier, and I disagreed with the arguments people made for why it would be fine for Kid and Law to be the ones to permanently take out Big Mom, which is why I'm going to be breaking down why exactly that story route would have been terrible, and why Luffy versus Big Mom is still an absolute necessity in this story. But before we get into it, it is time for something very important, and that is getting you a clean slate with Incogni, the sponsor for this video. What do I mean by that? Well, right now, your personal data is probably in the hands of thousands of different sources that are selling it to different businesses. Think back to any time that you've signed up for something, maybe a site, maybe a newsletter, maybe a subscription, maybe a store's loyalty card, anything. The moment you do that, you've opened up your data to now be sold to countless other businesses who from then on are going to be targeting you with unwanted ads, promotions, emails, all of that stuff. Not to mention data leaks. Even if you never gave your info to a certain company personally, that company probably got sold it anyway at some point. And now imagine if that company gets their data breached, like Twitch did recently. Well, now your phone number, your home address, your names of your relatives, all of that info is in the hands of strangers to do with as they please. However, there is a loophole, which is that you can technically ask data brokers to delete the information they have on you and protect your privacy. But the problem is, if you try to do this manually, it will take literally years of your time. There is so much information on you that is already out there. However, Incogni will actually do it for you automatically. Incogni will automatically reach out to all data brokers and get your data deleted so no one has any info on you. No long process, no dealing with objections, the whole thing is automated and Incogni does the work for you, giving you a clean slate. And the best part is, the first 100 people to use code Mr. Morge will get 20% off of Incogni. Just hit the link in the description below. Again, the first 100 people who hit the link below and use code Mr. Morge will get 20% off Incogni. So the rationale that I saw behind most people saying that Kid and Law permanently beating Big Mom here would have been good was because of the argument that it fits the theme of the new generation surpassing the old. And this sounds nice, but it's actually a terrible argument, because by that logic, you can pretty much justify Kid or Law or hell any other supernova doing pretty much anything in the story, even if it contradicts a tremendous amount of prior narrative buildup. For example, most people believe that Luffy or Blackbeard or both will eventually get to one day fight and defeat Shanks. Now, imagine if Oda scraps that and instead, Urauch comes out of nowhere and defeats Shanks. No Luffy and Shanks, no Blackbeard and Shanks, no, just randomly, next arc, Urauch runs into Shanks and permanently defeats him, and that's the end of Shanks in the story. I mean, technically, that fits the theme of the new generation surpassing the old, so in that case, sure, we can forget about all that other prior storytelling that was built up, right? Now, that obviously makes no sense, and I'm sure most of you would agree that should never happen in the story. And yes, it's a deliberately extreme example, Urauch just taking out Shanks, but I'm simply establishing the point that just because you might be able to come up with a theme or a message to justify certain events happening, that's not a free pass where just anything goes, everything else gets thrown out the window, since themes are not the only thing that matter in a story. Just because you can give a thematic reason for why something can justifiably make sense, that thematic reason still has to be weighed against everything else that matters in the narrative that was established beforehand. I know I obviously talk about themes a lot because themes are very important to the story, but I often see people take this line of thinking the wrong way and assumes that that means that anything makes sense in the story as long as there's some thematic justification for it. But that's really not how that works. Themes are just one pillar of storytelling. There is a lot more that matters as well, such as the setup and payoff to long-running conflicts or core driving character motivations and relationships. That's why when people were saying, Kid and Law defeating Big Mom permanently is okay because it fits a theme, that wasn't a particularly strong argument because it fails to acknowledge the much more significant narrative that has already been built up around Luffy defeating Big Mom, which, by the way, is also still thematically fitting of the idea of the new generation surpassing the old. So I think a lot of this maybe stems from people having forgotten the ridiculous, unprecedented amount of buildup across the entirety of post-time skip that has gone into the conflict of Luffy versus Big Mom. This was in fact the very first conflict, the very first antagonist that was established for Luffy going into the New World. Big Mom was literally the first definitive goal that Oda set for Luffy before he stepped foot in the New World. Big Mom was the first voice to call him out and the first challenge that Luffy himself threw down, the first challenge that he was clearly extremely driven to overcome. Since then, the Luffy and Big Mom conflict has been doubled down upon over and over, with the entire Whole Cake Island arc serving as the setup to their ultimate showdown. That entire conflict, an 80-chapter arc of these two pirate captains developing their very personal hatred and personal animosity towards each other, with Big Mom nearly killing Luffy and his crew, and Luffy ruining her reputation and public image. All the while spending a great amount of focus on developing that personal animosity, that personal hatred for each other, starting with their furious exchange before the Tea Party, to then their actual showdown, where Luffy made it explicitly clear that defeating Big Mom is his goal, to Luffy's final promise to Katakuri that Luffy would one day defeat Big Mom. From start to finish across this arc, it was beaten into our heads that Luffy will one day fight and defeat this enemy. And the same goes for Big Mom. The extremely personal hatred that developed between these two pirates was so important that it actually led to Big Mom breaking the rules of the entire Yonko system, coming to Wano and entering the war explicitly because she wants to take down Luffy just as bad as he wants to defeat her. And let's be very, very clear here. Big Mom's primary goal, primary desire in the series right now, the entire reason she came here, is defeating Luffy. Getting the ancient weapons, becoming Pirate King, all of that stuff is explicitly a backseat goal to her number one desire at this moment, which is Luffy. Fishman Island's ending, and more importantly, all of Whole Cake Island, built up the personal animosity between these two over hundreds of chapters and repeatedly hyped up the inevitable final battle between them. So to put this into context, to be perfectly absolutely clear, you can look at every single major arc villain Luffy has had so far. Arlong, Crocodile, NL, Lucci, Moria, Doflamingo, whoever. Luffy's personal, antagonistic relationship with Big Mom dwarfs all of these past villains by a huge margin, both in terms of time spent in build-up, repeat encounters, repeated stated desires and promises to beat them. Pretty much any category you can think of, in Luffy's story, Big Mom is a far more prominent and personal villain than any other arc boss Luffy has ever faced. Literally the only characters that have an argument for Luffy having a more significant personal antagonistic relationship with are Akainu and Blackbeard. That's it. Even the build-up to Luffy and Kaido was less personal and more recent than Luffy versus Big Mom. I'd even argue that Luffy's dynamic with Kaido is much closer to mutual respect than Luffy's straight-up anger and hate towards Big Mom. To say that Oda has not put in a tremendous amount of time, greater than any past opponent, into building up Luffy versus Big Mom as practically a sworn necessity, a deep-seated, ingrained personal desire for both of their characters, is flat out false. As a reminder, for Luffy, the entire New World so far has been alternating between the conflicts of Kaido and Big Mom. Fishman Island set up Big Mom, Punk Hazard set up Kaido. Dressrosa re-established the looming conflict of Big Mom while still taking steps towards defeating Kaido. Zoe was about the two flashbacks of Kaido's crew invading the island and Big Mom's crew invading the island. Whole Cake Island was Big Mom's domain, now Wano is Kaido's domain. And even within the Wano arc itself, Act 1 ended with a showdown between Luffy and Kaido, and Act 2 ended with a showdown between Luffy and Big Mom. Like, it's non-stop. Oda is remarkably consistent. The idea is beaten into our heads constantly, incessantly, over and over, that Luffy's story in the New World so far is absolutely defined by his conflict with both of these villains. And both of these villains are his challenge to ultimately overcome. He is alternating between both of these villains. To say that all of a sudden, it makes sense for all of that to be scrapped, for Kid and Law to be the ones to take down Big Mom, because new generation defeat the old, is just absurd. Now, let me acknowledge that, of course, not all fights in the series need build-up. Obviously, most fights in One Piece don't have any personal build-up beforehand. Usually, Straw Hats are just going to be matched up against someone they've never met before. However, a basic, pretty much universal rule of storytelling in general is that when there is some personal animosity or relationship or buildup between a protagonist and antagonist, that you now have an expectation set that this matchup is what the story is leading to. And Luffy and Big Mom isn't really subtle. It's a gigantic, long-running personal conflict between sworn enemies, like literally sworn enemies, the definition of sworn enemies. A gigantic, long-running conflict between sworn enemies that has been a huge influence in shaping the entire plot of the New World. So even if not all fights need to have build-up, fights that do have an absurd level of build-up, such as this, do need to be delivered on, otherwise nothing really means anything in the story. Why should we care about all the setup for Luffy versus Blackbeard if that could just be thrown out the window someday to give, I don't know, Sabo a fight? Now, yes, I will acknowledge that Kid and Big Mom did technically have some small bit of history. Kid destroyed some of her ships, and he did steal something from her territory. So technically there was something there. Now, if this had played into creating some sort of personal motivation to defeat each other, then we would have had something, but their past was essentially meaningless, as throughout the Wano arc, it is never referenced, nor is either character ever shown giving a shit about the other. Throughout the Wano arc, up until their fight actually started, Big Mom did not once even mention Kid's name, not once even acknowledged Kid's existence, up until literally the chapter that Kid suddenly randomly said, "I'll take Big Mom." Like, until their fight actually happened, Big Mom had not even once addressed Kid personally. Kid himself only even brings up Big Mom once to reference that he stole something from her. Besides that piece of trivia, it's not like Big Mom is ever someone relevant to Kid in the arc, or someone that Kid ever even talks about or addresses, or even bothers attacking on the roof, whereas again, Big Mom and Luffy was continually played up throughout the arc from both directions. And that's not even to say anything about Law, who very literally has zero history with Big Mom. So you're really weighing what is being lost here and for what purpose. If after all that build-up between Luffy and Big Mom and how much it was hammered in over and over and over and over again how important it is for both of their stories, for that to never lead to anything, and instead go arbitrarily to Kid and Law, who have extremely minimal connection to her, that's a tremendous amount of storytelling being crumpled up and tossed in the garbage. Now you might also be thinking, wait, doesn't Luffy himself pull this type of thing all the time? Doesn't Luffy always swoop in and beat up some bad guy that other characters have way more connection to? Well, it's not so much about connection to the villain, but rather who Oda continually frames as the person that needs to fight the villain. Essentially, which character's story is built around fighting the villain. Yes, you have characters like Nami in Arlong Park or Vivi in Alabasta, characters that develop great hate and personal animosity towards a villain that has caused their suffering for so long, and they want to see this villain defeated. But it is always clear from the start that it is not their role, their own place to defeat them, because they themselves know they can't. Oda never makes it seem as though Nami or Vivi's role or story is being built around defeating Arlong or Crocodile, whereas Oda always, from very early on, crafts Luffy's story around the notion that he is going to fight and defeat these villains on behalf of his friends and do what they cannot. Throughout One Piece, Oda is pretty much never taking somebody else's fight and just giving it to Luffy. Rather, he writes characters who need someone to fight for them, and then writes Luffy very clearly from the start of the arc to take up that role. Even in the most extreme case of Law and Doflamingo, guess what? Law's goal from the start was explicitly only ever to see Doflamingo defeated. Law himself never believed that he himself would be the one to defeat Doflamingo, and he never intended on fighting Doflamingo. Just because Law did end up fighting Doflamingo a bit in the end, that was clearly not his intent. Law's story from start to finish was never written with the end goal being for Law to personally defeat Doflamingo in combat. Whereas Luffy's goal was always, even before Law, to actually defeat Doflamingo. You see what I mean? Oda is a great writer. He's very careful with this stuff, even when he's getting down to extremely personal, long-running vendettas like Law and Doflamingo. If that fight is not ultimately going to go to Law, Oda makes sure not to make that fight a definitive goal for his character, as that is proper storytelling. You don't establish a certain fight as a defining goal for a character and then just throw it away and give it to somebody else. Same thing with Kiros. Kiros wanted to strike down Doflamingo, but as we got further into his story, it became clear that his most personal, most important vendetta that he wanted above all else was defeating Diamante, and he would forego Doflamingo for that. Even with other characters, look at Brook and Ryuma. Brook's personal goal was simply to get his shadow back. He didn't truly have a personal vendetta or established character need to specifically defeat Ryuma in combat. Hence, it was okay for Zoro to come in and take that fight for him. But Luffy and Big Mom? No. Across the entire 1,000 chapter story, defeating Big Mom has become one of Luffy's most long-running, explicitly, absolutely desired goals in history. Writing that and building that up for so long, and just to throw it away so that Kid and Law can get a fight and get some shine, that is not coherent storytelling. And such a massive scrapping of material is not simply hand-waved away by it fits a theme of new generation versus the old. So all of that is to say, I think that the way things played out is perfect. Kid and Law did need a significant showing, a good win during Onigashima, something to establish themselves as rising stars of the new generation. But at the same time, it could not come at the expense of the Luffy Big Mom conflict, as that has infinitely more narrative importance than simply checking off a box for Kid and Law that says they got a W in Onigashima. So for anyone disappointed in the outcome of the fight, I urge you to reread at least Whole Cake Island, and you will likely immediately change your mind and realize how insanely important it is that Luffy is the one who ultimately defeats Big Mom for good. Now, if you think that it's going to be too tiresome for the story for Big Mom to be dragged on to another arc where it will now be anticlimactic if Luffy defeats her so much later, well, that's a separate discussion. Although, of course, you all know I personally don't think that'll be an issue, as I think Big Mom will likely be back in full force soon this arc once the tables turn for the Alliance, and Luffy will likely get his chance to personally take her down in the second half of this arc before his final bout with Kaido. And I think that is precisely why Oda went with the type of victory he did. Dropping Big Mom down a hole seems like an extremely deliberately temporary way to get her out of the battle for a short period of time and give the protagonists a false sense of victory for the moment. But I know many of you may not believe in any of that, and that's okay, because if you enjoyed the rest of this video, then definitely like, comment, and subscribe. And the first 100 people to click the link in the description below and use code Mr. Morge will get 20% off of Incogni.